Unit 1, Cognitive Psychology. Presentation 2, the multi-store model.
Psychologists have developed many different theories of memory. Such theories are representations of how memory might work. For many years, the dominant theory was the multi-store model, proposed by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin in 1968.
There are two key features of this multi-store model. First, it consists of 3 separate memory stores, and second, the model explains how information is transferred between these stores.
You might have seen a diagram of the multi-store model. Such diagrams show 3 boxes in a row, representing 3 kinds of memory: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. On such a diagram, there are also arrows from one box to the next, indicating that information moves from one box to another. So, first of all, let's look at the 3 stores.
Starting with sensory memory.
Duration. As we already have said, information is retained for a very brief period of time by the sensory stores, a matter of seconds. Capacity. The amount of information held in sensory memory is very large.
How large?
In the case of visual sensory memory, over 1 million individual pieces of data are stored at any one time. The final aspect of sensory memory is encoding. The way that information is stored depends on the sense organ involved. For example, it is stored visually for what you see and acoustically for what you hear.
The second store is short-term memory. Short-term memory is our memory for immediate events. It has limited duration and limited capacity. Data is usually encoded acoustically in short-term memory. However, encoding might also be visual if you are remembering something you have seen.
The third store is long-term memory. This is memory for events that have happened in the past. The duration of long-term memory is, not surprisingly, long. This could be of anything from 2 minutes to 100 years if you're lucky. So it is usually described as unlimited. The capacity of our long-term memory store is also unlimited. And finally, encoding in long-term memory tends to be in terms of meaning. In other words, it is semantic. Moving information from one store to another. We'll start again with sensory memory.
This is where information first enters our brain. If your attention is focused on it, this information is transferred to short-term memory. For example, at all times your eyes are taking in data. This is held in your visual sensory memory. However, you're not aware of all this information unless you actually focus on it. And at that moment, this information is transferred to your short-term memory. Once it is there, you can do something with it or work on it, which is why short-term memory is also called working memory.
Second, information is maintained in short-term memory.
In short-term memory, information is in a fragile state, and it disappears if it isn't repeated or rehearsed or worked with. If more information comes into your short-term memory, then the old information is displaced because short-term memory has a limited capacity, perhaps just 7 items.
Third, information held in short-term memory might eventually become a long-term memory.
The more you rehearse something, the more likely it is to become a long-term memory. In other words, the more likely you are to remember it the next day, or in a week, or in years to come. Therefore, we say that information is transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory through the process of rehearsal. In particular, Atkinson and Schifrin suggest this was verbal rehearsal, in other words, saying something over and over again. Evaluating the multi-store model. The first strength of the model is that it is very easy to test its predictions experimentally.
This is a crucial feature of any theory, because it's the only way we can find out how right or wrong the theory is. So psychologists test particular predictions of the theory. For example, they do experiments to see if the short-term and long-term memory are really different in terms of encoding. There are many predictions from the multi-store model that can be tested, so we can find out if it is right or wrong.
The second strength is that many relevant studies have been conducted and they provide support for this model. Here are a few of the studies.
Sperling conducted a classic lab experiment to demonstrate the duration of sensory memory. He showed participants 12 letters at a time, and the letters were arranged in 3 rows. The display disappeared after 50 milliseconds, and then the participants had to say what they remembered. He found they could recall about 5 items, which is 42%. However, if he changed the procedure so that they were told to focus on just 1 row as soon as the display disappeared, they could recall 3 of the 4 items in that row, which is 75%. This shows that information decays rapidly in the sensory store, which of course is one of the predictions made in the multi-store model, that information is held in sensory memory only very briefly.
A second study that supports the predictions of the multi-store model is a case study by Scoville and Milner. They carried out a case study of a man referred to as HM. HM had suffered brain damage because of an operation to deal with his severe epilepsy. The operation removed his hippocampus. One of the consequences of this operation was that he could no longer form new long-term memories, although he was still able to perform short-term memory activities, such as adding numbers. This shows that there are separate short and long-term memory stores.
More recent research using brain scanning techniques has shown that certain areas of the brain are active when a person is engaged in short-term memory tasks, and other areas are active when long-term memory is involved. For example, Beardsley found that the prefrontal cortex is linked to short-term memory tasks, and Squire showed that the hippocampus is active when long-term memories are involved. This research again supports the short-term, long-term memory difference.
There are also important weaknesses of the multi-store model. A major issue is the idea of the short and long-term memory as single stores. More recent research has shown that we don't just have one single short-term memory. For example, Baddeley's research related to the working memory model has shown that there are separate verbal and visual stores, the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. Other researchers have identified different types of long-term memory store. For example, Spears and colleagues studied patients who could remember how to ride a bicycle but couldn't remember what they were doing this time last year. Memory for doing things, like riding a bicycle, are called procedural memories, whereas memory for events, such as what you were doing this time last year, are called episodic memories.
A second major weakness of the multi-store model relates to the way information is rehearsed when transferred from short to long-term memory. Craik and Lockhart demonstrated that simple repetition of information is not enough to convert memories from short-term to long-term. It works for certain kinds of information, but in general we use elaborative rehearsal rather than simple verbal or maintenance rehearsal. Elaborative rehearsal involves deeper processing where we think about the meaning of memories, whereas maintenance rehearsal refers to a more simple process where you just say something over and over again.
So what can we conclude? Research does support the view that there are a number of different memory stores that differ in terms of capacity. These stores differ in terms of duration, capacity, and encoding, and in the way that data is transferred between them, as described by the multi-store model. However, the main issue is that the multi-store model is an oversimplification of what is going on in our brain, and subsequent theories have addressed this complexity, which is why the multi-store model is no longer the preferred theory of memory.